Coming up on Triangulation, I talked to Jessica Powell. She was a former VP at Google, head of communications, and she just wrote The Big Disruption, a totally fictional but essentially true story of Silicon Valley.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
This is Triangulation, episode 399, recorded May 20th, 2019. Jessica Powell, The Big Disruption. We have a survey for you that focuses on how you use collaborative software at work. It's brief, it takes only about 6 minutes. Please go to twit.to/survey14. Thanks. Welcome to Triangulation. This is the show where every week we talk to the people, the big thinkers in technology, people writing about technology, people making new technology. And a lot of that happens, of course, in Silicon Valley. And if you follow the news, you know that Silicon Valley truth is often stranger than fiction. But the newest novel, not necessarily new, sort of new in paperback, The Big Disruption is pretty strange. It's The Big Disruption, a totally fictional but essentially true Silicon Valley story. And I'm thrilled to welcome its author, Jessica Powell. She is also the author of Literary Paris, and she's written for Wired and the New York Times, The Guardian, and others. And she was also former vice president of communications for Google, where she served on Google's management team. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessica.
Thanks for having me. So,
the book is a hilarious send-up of Silicon Valley. It's as I said, you were on the management team at Google, but I've read that it's important to you to express that this is not a Google tell-all. Talk a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. I mean, I didn't want this to be a book about a single company, such that everyone would be like, oh, well, if she's being critical about Google, or if she's, talking about one particular quirky culture, it's all about Google. I really wanted it to be much broader than that. And I wanted it to resonate with people who work in tech or pay a lot of attention to tech or just feel like tech is affecting their lives. And I didn't want to pigeonhole it. And also because when I wrote this, I wasn't at Google, which I think a lot of people think was the case, that I was sitting there like in the hallways secretly scribbling notes after meetings. No, I was actually at a startup, this insane startup. And that it started off not as a book, not as anything. It was just this cathartic exercise of trying to get all of my frustrations down on paper in this really hyperbolic, exaggerated way of trying to make sense of the world around me in my day-to-day life.
So the book came out in the fall on Medium. The full book was published. Anyone could read it. And then it came out in paperback last month, correct?
Right, yeah. The book, I wrote it years ago. It didn't go anywhere. That in itself is a whole story, is the many ways it did not go anywhere. And then it, I think in last summer, a friend sent it to a friend who sent it to a friend. Anyway, eventually made its way to Medium, where they said they didn't read they don't publish books and they didn't publish fiction, but they would read it as a favor to this person, and they read it and they liked it and they decided to publish it. And the whole thing from when they read it to published it was, I don't know, probably 2 months, maybe less than that. And then it did really well. It had over, I think over 150 or 175,000 readers. And so then they said, gosh, we should do this as a print book and an ebook. And then that just all came out a month ago.
So yeah, you sort of passed over the story, which I find fascinating. You started in 2012. Is that when you started writing this?
Right, yeah.
So that was like before Silicon Valley, the HBO show, before Dave Eggers' The Circle. And so when you first tried to talk a little bit about what people said when you first tried to pitch it to people, this story of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, well, I was really interested in this idea of how a tech company goes from doing one thing to then another and another and another, and just this sort of ceaseless expansion of the big tech companies. And even back in 2012, you could already see this with Google. By that point, it's doing maps, it's doing self-driving cars. Facebook is well beyond the feed. Amazon, of course, is no longer a diaper store or books for that matter. It's doing a million things. And I found that fascinating. And I not only did I find that fascinating, I thought it was so much more interesting in a lot of ways than the stuff that I was already seeing in Europe. Europe was critical of tech way before the US was. And they were, much like the US today, quite fixated on privacy issues. And I thought that was a bit of a red herring. Like, I really don't think the end game is just to get everyone's data and destroy us with our data. And so I wanted to explore that. And so that was how the book, that's one of the things that the book explores. And so I actually got an agent quite quickly. And she was very confident that she would sell the book in like a day or two. But I think importantly, she was based in San Francisco. Her husband worked in tech. She was surrounded by tech. And so I think maybe she thought it was more sellable than it perhaps was. So she goes to New York, meets all the major publishing houses, and they all turn it down, saying that they thought it was funny and well-written, but there was zero commercial appeal for a book like this. That the only reason that the author, I was anonymous at the time, the only reason that the author thought that the book was interesting and sellable was because the author worked in tech and therefore thought it was bigger. But I could already tell I didn't have any confidence necessarily in the writing or the humor or anything. I didn't know how to write a book. But I did feel very, very convinced that tech was only going to get bigger and that the interest in tech was only going to grow. But what could you do? I was like shut out by the gatekeepers, so to speak. And so the book just sat there for a number of years. And I ended up going back to Google and working at Google. And then rather coincidentally, it was when I left and that friend sent the manuscript on that then all of a sudden it came back to life.
So you tweeted, I think this week about it was a good example of how things have changed. I don't remember the year that Sergey Brin jumped out of the plane at Google I/O. Was he the one that jumped out of the plane?
Yeah, they were doing, I think, trying to, as some kind of thing with Google Glass, he jumped out of a helicopter as one does and landed on, I think, the Miss Moscone Center conference as one does, and then, hops down in his jumpsuit or whatever onto the stage to roars of applause and so forth. Yeah.
Right. And then to this year at Google I/O, there was a plane flying over, critical of Google, saying something about privacy. And just like the change, so it's a different time now. Talk a little bit about the changes and what you think about how they've come about, people's view of technology since you were first pitching the book.
Right. I mean, in Europe, the Europeans were always much more skeptical of the big tech companies. I think because, first of all, they were American companies showing up in Europe, promising great things and having these big mission statements. And I think Americans have a track record of doing that in a lot of places where they promise you all kinds of things and don't necessarily deliver. So I think there was a natural element of suspicion and even confusion. Like, okay, you're a company, but you're saying you're not a company. You're almost acting like you're a social movement. And yet, aren't you still selling us something? And don't you still want us to buy something? And why aren't you just being more honest about that? So I think there was a natural amount of skepticism around that. They also, I think European copyright and privacy laws are much stronger than the US. And so there was a much stronger reaction against a lot of the things that the big tech companies were doing right from the start. And whereas in the US, not only did we not have some of the same legal frameworks or concepts, but also like we love our homegrown companies. I mean, most countries love their homegrown companies. But in particular, I think in the US, we love our like Horatio Alger, like rags to riches. In our case, you started in a garage or you started in a dorm room. It feels almost meritocratic, right? Like this idea of like coming out of nothing and building up something huge and anyone can do it. And it's so inspiring. We love those stories. And we loved the kind of mission statement. We love the success, the almost manifest destiny-like qualities of these companies and their expansion. And so I think it took us a lot longer to come to the same realizations or the same kinds of criticisms that other parts of the world were throwing at the tech companies from much earlier on.
So we did say a little. So you got your first job at Google in Paris, is that correct?
In London.
London. So you were abroad and you were working there. And when you started working there, it was what year did you start working at Google?
2006. I was hired as a contractor. Yeah.
So that was a time when the don't be evil was not. I mean, that was something that everyone loved about Google and believed in. Talk a little bit about what it was like to be there in the beginning.
I joined in part because no one else would hire me. I just arrived from Tokyo and had been working as a journalist, and I show up in London where everyone speaks English. And that, which at 26 was pretty much my only marketable skill, was not really that attractive to any particular journalism outlets there. So I applied for waitress jobs. I applied to be a CEO of some job. I applied for everything that was in the Guardian ads, and no one called me back. But I also applied to Google, and I think I just got lucky on the particular day that someone was actually looking at the stack of resumes. They looked at mine, and I came in and was hired. So I failed all my interviews. I got hired as a contractor, but I totally failed my full-time employee interviews. But when I came, what I was excited about or interested about with Google was they had a project called Google Book Search, which was digitizing the world's books. And while they went about it in a rather ham-fisted way, in terms of how they dealt with the publishers, I thought it was pretty inspiring, this idea of taking a lot of out-of-copyright books in particular and putting them online so that anyone anywhere in the world could consult them. And so I had this contrast of, on the one hand, really, really believing in the mission of what we were doing. I still think it's a cool idea. With this public reception, particularly from the publishers who felt like Google were stealing their work. And I think it was on my first or second day there that I had to go to a meeting with publishers where I was supposed to represent Google. And I just got yelled at for 2 hours straight by a bunch of people telling me that I was a thief and had violated copyright. And it was quite like a bath of cold water.
Were they yelling at you in a British accent? So at least it was a little bit nicer?
It was very crisp, very articulate, very polysyllabic. And they were far more established and professional and impressive than I was at 26, for sure. I did a great job.
So let's fast forward a little bit. Tech is right now, I mean, there's so many complaints. There's the tech lash. I hate that word, but I feel it. And, there's a lot of common complaints where we're addicted to our screens, or, they're violating our privacy. Just a lot of those complaints, but yours is slightly different. And I think a little more essential. The metaphor, the metaphor of the book, the object that represents this, I think, is the squid, which is the story starts with it, and it's just throughout this thing that is a sort of a mascot of the main company, Anahata, But you can see, I think you talked about it a little bit earlier, why are these companies in everything? Why are there forever expanding tentacles in every part of our lives? So is that the major point that you were trying to make with the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's absolutely that. It was so frustrating all those years when nothing was happening with the book, because Silicon Valley, the show, happened, which was funny. I didn't think it necessarily had a meta point to it, but that's fine. It was funny. And then there were all these movies and books like The Circle, and they were just, particularly on the movie and book side, I felt like they were these crazy dystopias, which could be entertaining depending on what you thought of them. But if you were in the Valley, I didn't feel like when say The Circle came out, there wasn't any conversation, at least in my corner of Google, about that book, because it was so removed from what any of us were doing on a day-to-day side. It was so removed from the way anyone talked about what they were building. I mean, even in the darkest sense, when you would try and channel the way something could go, you wouldn't arrive at the conclusions that came in that book. And I just remember thinking, what all this criticism of the industry, and yet no one's really talking to the industry. And I also felt that really at the end of the day, the people who are the most powerful are not the regulators. It's actually not so much public pressure. It's the employees. And if you can't talk to the employees and find a way to connect with them and appreciate what's been done in the Valley and what's being built and all the ingenuity and entrepreneurship, while also being critical and asking people to think a little bit more about the consequences of what they're building, then you're really not going to make that much progress. You're just going to keep regulating or legislating your way, ideally out of problems, but probably not, probably just creating new problems in the process. And so I really wanted to do something along those lines. I was hoping that the book would reach tech people, like people who actually care and like and are engaged with tech and the conversation around tech.
Do you think it has?
I mean, granted, people don't email me out of the blue to say, like, I hated your book and I did not read it. But the feedback I've heard, particularly from people in a lot of the big companies, is that there are a lot of people reading it, and there have been a lot of conversations in the micro kitchens, around about the book. And I think that I think there is an appreciation that there's something out there that can laugh at the industry and laugh with the industry and appreciate some of the stuff that I do think just makes this industry pretty unique, but also call us to task a little bit for some of our hypocrisy and lack of foresight.
So it's satire, as I think we've said already, and it's just very exaggerated, but also true.
Just a little.
I've never worked for any of these big companies. I can only assume from what I've read that it's mostly true. But the thing about satire that's fascinating to me, I don't know if you listen to Malcolm Gladwell or his podcast. He has one about the Satire Paradox. And it's sort of about how sometimes satire doesn't really reach the right people. It makes people sort of laugh with them. Like, I think there was a lot of like maybe making fun of Donald Trump a year or two ago might have been this way, or not Donald Trump, like George Bush maybe. And the people that you're sort of satirizing laugh with you and say like, oh, ha, 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 I'm not like that. Do you think that any of that is happening?
I think that can happen, but I think the thing that and there are parts of the book where if I were being really critical, I could say, oh yeah, maybe that people just laugh along, and because it's so exaggerated, they don't see themselves in it. Though I think there's enough there where you recognize the types in terms of the characters, or you recognize some of the behaviors that I do think there's a lot that should resonate. But I think the underlying point of the book, I have yet to meet a person who works in tech who has not seen a lot of this in their company, and that when they've read the book has not been able to relate something that was happening at their company, past or present, to something they saw in the book. And so I do feel, maybe I'm delusional, I do feel like that it's getting through on some level. I don't think it's, you necessarily come away from the book and you're like, here's my 5-point plan for fixing the tech industry, and here's what I'm going to do about content regulation. No. But that it would stick with you, and I think question a little bit more, particularly I think the questions around how you're building products and how you're talking about the products and who you include in the conversations of when you're building those products and who you don't include. I think that does come across pretty clearly in the book. I've never worked at a tech company that I would say has really embraced inclusion. And I've never worked at a tech company where I would say there wasn't a certain element of feeling like your users don't entirely know what they want, and almost in the most benign way, a level of disdain for the user, and thinking that you, as an engineer, say sitting, in front of your computer, are going to make much, much better decisions than the feedback that you're getting from people in the real world or people who interface with the real world. So, I Malcolm Gladwell, I don't know, I haven't heard that podcast, but I'm very, I do not have 10,000 hours to theorize about satire to become an expert on it. So maybe he's onto something. And all of my life's work has been a big failure. Thanks, Malcolm.
It was interesting to me because I do think, I don't know, it's an interesting podcast to listen to, because I think what he points out mostly is Tina Fey's imitation of, and I can't remember her name, but she was the one that was McCain's VP, and from Alaska. But she makes fun of, everyone thought that was hilarious, everyone on both sides, and it didn't really change anyone's opinion. But that's something different. So
Yeah, I do think, just to interject, I do think, though, again, without having seen that specific piece, and perhaps in that particular example, there wasn't enough of an overall point beyond, oh, this person is comic. And so therefore there isn't really a takeaway beyond both sides of the aisle laughing at that. And there is some value at both sides of the aisle also being able to laugh at something too, I would say. But I do think literature is really important, particularly when you work in tech. We talk so much about data and the importance of data. We don't tend to talk a lot about fiction. We don't tend to talk a lot about narratives. But I think literature has the opportunity, and the humanities generally, to connect with people in a different way, right? I think it is even something that's so exaggerated. I think it can kind of jar you or throw you out of your day-to-day way you're thinking about something. And I think there's something very powerful and human about that. And that nothing should ever be entirely fiction or humanities, but that we shouldn't also only ever be looking at spreadsheets and data all the time and thinking that that also reflects what the world actually looks like.
I guess maybe your instinct to explain to people that this isn't just about Google. Like, this is about, I guess that's why it raises above that satire paradox level, because it's like people at Twitter or Facebook or Apple or Microsoft might say like, haha, look at this ex-Googler who wrote this book. But your point is that everyone in the Valley, giant companies and tiny startups, are having these same problems.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yes, absolutely. Also, we all worked at each other's companies, so how would we not be? Like, if you were working at Google at some point, you then went to Twitter, or you went to Facebook, or you went to Uber. Like, maybe you didn't go to Apple, because Apple is like this weird alien ship, but that no one goes in and out of. But like, for the most part, right? Like, there's kind of only a handful of companies you're working at, unless you then like break off and go do your startup, and then you're in a different sort of parallel ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there are no women engineers. There's no real diversity among the engineering or the salespeople or the management team, and that was intentional. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I should correct you. There is one female engineer who has an unfortunate mole who appears
at the
for
end.
one sentence. Yeah, exactly. Important correction. Yes, I mean, satire is a hammer for sure. And obviously there are more women. There's more than one woman working in engineering at any of these companies for the most part. But I really wanted to make a point by eliminating a lot of voices. It's not just women. There are like very few people of color, except in very, I guess, strategic moments, you could say. Because I wanted to reflect, again, in a very exaggerated way, the reality in a lot of these companies that talk a lot about the importance of diversity. But when you actually look at the numbers year on year, the progress is very incremental. And I think a lot of it's one thing to just look at hiring and pipeline issues, which is kind of everyone's favorite thing to talk about. But there isn't that much attention always on retention or the actual work environment and how that impacts people who are at the company. So anyway, I wanted to touch on that in the book as well. And the journey of the one woman in the book, I think, without giving anything away, is I would say that she probably comes across as the smartest, scrappiest, most resourceful of the bunch, and ends up doing something that could save the company. But she starts off as a receptionist and ends as a receptionist.
And she doesn't escape the hammer necessarily either. I mean,
she's a horrible person. Yeah, totally horrible. Yeah. I mean, that was the worst, right? Like, the thing I absolutely did not want to do was write a book where everyone's like horrible, but in this wonderful, like delicious way where you just you kind of can't get enough of them because they're such bad people. I didn't want to have a book where it's like all the really interesting people are all just these men. And then you have this one woman who's gets very few of the lines, but saves the company in the end. And she's the one good person. That's the worst. That's every Hollywood movie right now. You either make it a woman or a person of color just to make yourself feel very progressive and good. But in the meantime, they're the least interesting characters. They have no lines. No, I wanted, if I was going to have evil men, because I wanted this contrast of, tech is often telling people that it's their savior and that it's saving the world. And I wanted to contrast a lot of that essentially marketing speak. And I think people do believe it, right? There's this like belief in a lot of these companies. I wanted to contrast that with some morally questionable figures. And so if I was going to have evil guys, I definitely wanted to have a very suspect woman as well.
I think I read somewhere that you say like there are no good characters, but Nadia, she's not a main character, but she's essentially good.
I mean, I guess like when you're getting to the point where you have to find a character who appears for 5 pages to cite a good person. I think there's probably also like a dog that pops up somewhere in the book that like, is really cute. And
And we don't know that the squid is evil. It just seems that way.
Right. Never know.
So what about the monoculture that this creates and how that affects the products that people are creating? What can you say about that?
I mean, I just think it's sort of extraordinary that a lot of these companies, particularly the ones that are based on ads, talk a lot about building for everyone, which of course is the business model, right? Like if everything's ad-based, then you need to build for everyone because that's how you monetize, is the more ads you can put in front of more people. But everyone talks so much about building for everyone, and yet the actual companies, the makeup of those companies doesn't remotely look like the world that you're building for. And so while a lot of the conversation around diversity or inclusion gets couched in all of these HR terms and is usually relegated to HR discussions or the HR person is in charge of it, like it just seems to me that to be a no-brainer business logic piece that if you could be more diverse, you'd probably have slightly better instincts in terms of what to build and how to communicate and how to get it to market and some of the pitfalls along the way. Like you look at, there's so many examples that range from, okay, annoying and kind of innocuous, like, okay, that when they released all the first smartwatches, they were huge and there wasn't a single one that could fit on a woman's wrist, which is annoying. No one's going to die because of it. But like that kind of thing, through to like more, there's been studies done around, when they do crash test dummies, those are all male bodies, right? Which means the impact is different on female forms. Or there was like the example, of course, on Google Photos with where they identified an African-American woman as an ape, because there's no one on the QA team. There's no one on the I believe on the engineering team that was African-American. And while it shouldn't be that person's job to police like this product to make sure that it's right, I imagine it's also like, you could imagine if there were more people from different backgrounds working on a given product, you're more likely to run into those issues earlier on. Or like look at Uber with women, right? There were very, very few women in leadership there. Perhaps it would have been a slightly different culture if there had been. So anyway, the examples go on. And the impact can be both internal, of course, in terms of the environment for the employees, but also external in terms of what you build, what you choose to build, and how you choose to build it.
And in the book, there's a group working on something called Social Car, which essentially has, if you're in a car and you want to meet someone nearby, your car will automatically, the other car will slow down and your car will speed up and you'll get to ride alongside. And like through a fluke, Jenny, the character we were talking about before, ends up being a product manager. And she says, what if I don't want that? Can I turn it off? And they're just, they're clueless about the idea that anyone would not want this. Did you see a lot of stuff like that when you were either at the startup that you worked at or at Google?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there definitely was an attitude in every tech company I've ever interacted with or worked at, which is sort of that users don't really, they don't mess with this is actually, I think, statistically proven out. People don't mess that much with their settings. If you give them a ton of privacy options, they'll either be overwhelmed by them or they won't engage with them. At the same time, you do hide those options pretty far down the path and don't make them easy to get to because you don't really want people to be messing with them. And it becomes a bit of a chicken and egg thing in terms of discoverability and engagement with that stuff. And then a feeling, too, that people don't understand. They talk a lot about, say, privacy, but they don't understand what they're giving up if they use all these privacy settings in terms of customization or whatever. When I was at the dating app, we we had a ton of, like, we were very aware that women did not have good experiences on our app. Women generally do not have good experiences on dating apps. Most men adopt the approach of spamming as many women as they can in the hopes that they'll get a response. So imagine being a woman on the receiving end of that. And so most of the time what we were trying to figure out, or on the kind of product side, is just how far can you push the women without chasing them off the app? So how much can they be inundated? Or how do you withhold them from normal guys, but put them in front of all the guys that are willing to pay? And how do you withhold, say, some of the better looking women from men that aren't paying? All these kinds of sort of social interactions where you're sitting there, it's pretty dehumanizing.
Mm-hmm. Reading that part made me think of Eva Galperin, from the EFF, and she's working tirelessly on stalkerware, just stuff that people use to abuse their partners or former partners. And she says it's not that people being abused don't know about how computers work, it's that people who make computers don't know how abuse works. So do you think that is changing?
I mean, I'd like to think it's changing a little bit. I saw, no doubt this was pulled together by Twitter's PR team. Well done, Twitter's PR team. Thing the other day where they did like a behind the scenes, letting you in on this Twitter, kind of this parallel app that they're building to test new experiences on Twitter, that has to do around what I think that's trying to focus more on important or meaningful engagement versus having people perform, essentially, like the performative aspect of Twitter around like trying to get more likes and so forth. And again, this is the PR part of it, but hopefully authentic. They made sure that the spokespeople for all of this were women. And hopefully, in fact, it's the women who are designing this. I think that's very interesting because I do think you experience these, say, social media. I think you, particularly things like Twitter, you experience very, very differently if you are a woman, for example, or a person of color. There's a ton of research on this. This isn't just kind of like armchair philosopher. If you look at comments, it can also be like on online news sites. There's been a lot of work done around looking at the toxicity of comments online when the author of the article is a woman versus a man. So if all of the people designing these platforms are men and have never had the experience of feeling more vulnerable, they've never had the experience of like the thing that all of us women have done, no matter where we're from, of like walking through the parking lot with your keys in your hand, which you do all the time, every single time you like are going into a parking lot on your own. You're probably not going to build the same kind of social experience as someone that knows a little bit more of what it's to feel like constantly having your body be more vulnerable, right? Or be more vulnerable in a particular space. So I agree with what she's saying.
So in the essay, you wrote an essay about how you wrote the book, why you wrote the book, and you talk about how you don't think that the founders of these companies wake up every morning and think like, how can I steal people's data? But why do they do it? Is it the bottom line? Is it for fame, or like to have, is it why any of us do anything because we want to be remembered? Why do you think they're growing at this rate and expanding and sort of violating our privacy in the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the media sometimes paints these CEOs or people in tech generally as evil people, lack all empathy. And while I think the CEOs, both their level of quality, let's say, and their level of empathy varies from CEO to CEO, I don't think that they're evil people. And I think that they, for the most part, do have good intentions, and that a lot of what they said, particularly in the early days in terms of their mission statements and their visions, holds true. I don't think Twitter was built as a free speech platform because Jack Dorsey imagined it would become the cesspool that it has. I think it was very much out of this optimistic belief that more information is a good thing. But at the same time, I think what happens is you start building something and you get traction, and through a combination of a huge amount of availability of capital combined with a little bit of FOMO and watching what your competitors are doing, and wanting to be able to, not wanting someone to claim a space before you, and no blockers on your expansion, you just keep growing. And so if you're Google, for example, you start doing search, and search is going well, and then all of a sudden you realize that there's, I don't know, IE. Remember when we all used IE? That there's IE that can block you getting to search. So we better go build a browser. Now you've got Chrome. Chrome then overtakes everything. So you've got Chrome now. amazing. But then you figure out that, wait a second, like they can stop us at the hardware level. They can do IE as the default search and, default browser. So now you go and build your hardware. And then you've built your hardware and you say, but wait, what if people can't get onto the internet? Let's go do the fiber. Or if you're Facebook, you go the same way. You can go from newsfeed to get yourself to WhatsApp, to Instagram, to internet planes. Or Amazon, you go from diapers and books to then all of a sudden you own a grocery store. And it's like every single step, it's not necessarily that someone starts off saying, I'm going to be the diaper store online, and eventually one day I'm going to own all of groceries. I don't think that anyone is actually as clever as sometimes we ascribe to all of these men. But it's more that there's nothing ever stopping you or telling you you can't do these things. And you have so much money and a little bit of ego that you just keep going. And I think that's actually more concerning than the popular narrative around just wanting to steal everyone's data. Because if it was just to get everyone's data, we would know what the end game was. And you would have an idea of how to regulate that. I think it's actually harder when it's just around size.
Mm-hmm. And so I think people used to say that the biggest problem with Silicon Valley was that everyone walks around, like all these tech leaders walk around with everyone saying that, they're fantastic and they're great and there's nothing wrong with them and everything they're doing is great. But that's not happening anymore. I mean, there's a lot of complaints. Like, I don't know what happens, to Mark Zuckerberg when he walks the halls, if there are still a group of people following him, telling him how great he is. But I mean, generally people are suspicious, they're unhappy. Maybe they're leaving some platforms. Maybe they hate Facebook, but they're still using Facebook. I mean, do you think that has the ability to change just people's view of what's going on in tech, has the ability to make these people wake up and say, maybe we need to change the way we're doing things?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of it. At the CEO level, I think any company, any industry, once you have a lot of power, it is very, very difficult to build an infrastructure around you that will challenge you. Everything I think in human nature points towards us building infrastructures that reinforce what we think, whether it's working with people that we think are kind to us and nice, but essentially agree with us, and people who agree with our whims. So I think it's very, very hard for any of these CEOs to find their points of view challenged a lot. I think there's an infrastructure of yes that builds up anywhere. But I do think that where the public scrutiny is the most useful, and this kind of techlash, as you said, is because I think the employees there's always been a strong activist bent, particularly in companies like Google, and I would say probably at Twitter as well, Facebook a little bit less so, but still. And I think that the public scrutiny draws attention to issues that the employees might otherwise might not be aware of, or they might be fed a very different line on. And so the employees are now taking a lot more action in terms of trying to hold their companies accountable. I think that works a little bit more in companies that have, again, a really strong activist culture, and it can go in the other direction too, where it can probably go too far and the company can cave too much to employees. But I think when you look a lot at what's happened with Google, that's what you're seeing play out, where the employees don't feel that what Google's doing in some instances is right. And I think Facebook is perhaps not as far there. I think it's a little bit younger of a company, and I think it also is a little bit more insular in terms of I think it's still in a phase of feeling. I think it's only starting to turn that corner and not just feeling like it's a victim and blaming the media for the bad press. In the same way that I think Uber did for a long time as well too. So I think everyone's in sort of different stages in terms of how they are interacting with the whole techlash narrative. But yeah, I'm hopeful that there will be some change that will come through a combination of employee pressure, regulation, like smart regulation, which I think is key, and continued public scrutiny.
So what about the argument that their bottom line is dependent on these things that they've done? They can't. The ship is too big to turn around now. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I mean, yes and no. Like if it was a technology issue, I mean, think about Facebook. So I can think of just two examples off the top of my head. I remember quarter after quarter, we'd be sitting there preparing earnings call stuff for Google. And the analysts would get on there, and there would always be all this moaning about whether Google could monetize on mobile. And the press reports that would come out after every earnings call, even if earnings were good, even if we beat expectations, there would always have to be these like 2 or 3 paragraphs about mobile monetization, as if like that was something you were going to fix overnight, and or something that was impossible. But if, like the world went mobile, it was fine. You look at Facebook, which made that pivot to mobile even faster, right? Like they had a company mandate to go all in on mobile, and they did it. So I think it's hard to square this idea of asking really big questions and coming from things with like at first principles and a belief that you can really change things with somehow thinking, oh, but it's too big, we can't do anything. Do I think could be slow? Yes. Do I think I think the biggest fear really for these companies is one, that users, depending on what the product is, like something particularly for social, that users go elsewhere. And maybe they don't even go elsewhere necessarily because of their privacy concerns, but rather just because no one stays hot forever. And Facebook, like no young person's using Facebook, right? So I think first is just your users. Like, what does your user growth look like? And are users still using your product? And second, what about your employees? Because once you lose your tech talent in particular, I would say, your engineers, and you're no longer seen as a hot place to work, that's where I think you really start to suffer as well. And while you have a ton of money and you can pay people a lot, there are a lot of companies that can pay a lot of money. And so I think that's actually one of the biggest things these different companies worry about is if you, for example, are trying to get someone out of college to come down to Menlo Park or Palo Alto to work for your big tech company versus a startup in San Francisco that's a little bit smaller, can offer a bigger role and zero commute in a much more interesting city. And on top of that, you have reputation issues, which means that the kid's not getting pressure from their parents to go join this company that was so shiny 10 years ago. That's a problem. Like that's definitely a long-term problem.
So you published the entire book on Medium. What was that like? Because I mean, you have I like to read actual books, but I read this on my iPad and in the Medium app, and it was great. I loved it because I could bookmark, I could go back to where I was, close the app, open it up, it knew where I was. But also there were like lots of comments, like people just sort of commenting like you're in creative writing school, and people are commenting along. Like how does that feel? Do you read all those comments?
I didn't read the comments along the way because that just seems masochistic. Also because, the whole thing happened so fast that I was sure there'd be like a typo here or there. Well, I'm actually told that it's not crazy. So that's good to hear because I definitely make a lot of typos, at least on email. So no, I didn't read along the way. Also because there was just part of me. I had originally wanted to do this book anonymously. I didn't really want the attention. I wanted people to read it. I wanted them to laugh. I wanted them to talk about it. But I didn't really want to be involved in it at all. Like I just started a startup. I was busy with that. I was like 1 month postpartum with my third kid. Like I didn't want to be a part of the conversation at all. So I think there was also a little bit of denial on my part once it was published. I actually only went and read the comments, the comments at the very bottom. I think like a week or two ago, not out of desire so much as a feeling of, these people took this time to read it, and I should the least I can do for them is to read their comments and respond to the ones that are asking questions. So yeah, I don't think that's probably when I've done Medium articles for Medium, like much shorter. And, I try and engage in all the comments. Cause again, I think like people have taken the time to read what you had to say, and they have thoughts about it, and provided that they're engaging in a productive way. And why wouldn't you, give them your time back?
Mm-hmm. And so did you make any changes before the paperback came out?
Not before the paperback. I did. I have two answers to that. Before the paperback came out, I did go through because one of the Medium commenters had actually emailed or found me on Twitter and had DM'd me saying, at some point your CEO character, this guy Bobby, like 1 or 2 places he's called Barry was his original name, Barry, which is very funny because it was Barry, which some people are like, oh, it's Larry Page. And I'm like, Larry Page is not a nymphomaniac CEO who's like meditating with goats. the funny thing is the original CEO's name was Barry Bonds, because I'm not any good with names. And it was like, I was sitting in London, it's 2012. And I was just like, I need a name. And for some reason that came to me. And when I ended up showing it to my husband, he was like, you do know, he's like, I really don't understand the point you're getting at with like, is this a metaphor? Like what is this? Like a baseball player? Anyway, so then I just changed it to Bobby Bonillo. And then the other change I did was the before we published in October on Medium, I had read through the book and I wanted to read through it and see if there was anything that felt, super dated or anything like that. And interestingly, there was already actually like a fair amount of artificial intelligence and a little bit of like ML kind of references in there, while trying to keep it accessible, because I didn't want, people who didn't work in the field to not have any idea what was going on. But the thing I remember changing was early on, and it's not super important, but there's a scene in which one guy is explaining to another guy how VC capital works and how like working as a startup works. And it was funny because in that one paragraph in the initial version, in a comic way, he's basically talking about how money doesn't matter. And like, you don't have to make money off of your users. You just need to get a ton of users. And then, that'll sort of solve all of your problems. And I did have to go back and update that, because now the path of your VC is so different, because the power of the big companies is such that your most likely good outcome, like of course your most likely outcome is that you implode, but your most likely good outcome is actually acquisition, right? Not that you IPO. And the idea that you wouldn't have monetized, particularly then if you're building, say, like an enterprise solution or something like that. Like the thinking and the economics of it all is so different than it was in 2012 that I had to rewrite that. Anyway, it's a very silly example, but I remember just very much having a moment being like, oh yeah, that actually has changed quite a bit and I need to rewrite that.
So we do have a question in our chat room for you. Aspire asks what you think about is there a lack of people with disabilities having input in development process in tech companies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. On the whole, I would, without knowing any statistics around it, I would say yes. I was always really struck when I was at Google. There was a man named TV Raman who's visually impaired. And he always talked about the potential of mobile, because all of a sudden you have a device that can hear and see and do all these things that, say, a computer couldn't do. And that all and maybe that was a very common metaphor within the accessibility community, which I was not super plugged into, but that always struck me as such a powerful metaphor and something that I'd never felt that we fully tapped into. Because it makes you think so differently about how you design interfaces and so forth. And yet a lot of what he was doing is he was on the accessibility team, right? Which was not integrated in the same way that in the earlier days you had like a privacy, like in the same way you might have like a privacy guru that's supposed to go around and like evangelize like people caring about privacy. The accessibility efforts didn't always seem front and center of what we were doing. So, and of course that's just one example of accessibility, right? In terms of visually impaired users. So I think that it makes intuitive sense to me that would absolutely be a problem, but I don't know any of the statistics around it, because of course that's not one of the areas that people disclose when they do their annual reports.
So talk a little bit about what you're doing with the proceeds from the sale of the paperback book.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, when I did the digital one, I gave it to Yes We Code, which works on inclusion efforts, and Book Trust, which gives books to underserved communities, children in underserved communities. So a bit of analog, a bit of digital. This time around, I gave all the print proceeds are going to BINC, which is an organization that is that supports booksellers in times of need. Like quite a few booksellers work 2 to 3 jobs, and it's very much a labor of love. And I think, I get a lot of stuff off Amazon. I'm not going to be all self-righteous and pretend that that's not actually a really great, wonderful service. I use it all the time. But I also think booksellers have a part in our community and do wonderful things. And no one, not Netflix, not Amazon, no one does recommendations as well as booksellers do. At the very minimum, there is that. And they're a great support to authors. So I wanted to do something specifically for them. And yes, I recognized it was a little ironic given that I figured a lot of the sales would happen on Amazon.
So you're not in it. You're not in the satire business just for the money.
I think if I was, yeah, I think if you were to look at my tax returns from a year and a half ago when I left Google to now, it would look like a very poor life decision.
So what are you doing now? You mentioned your startup. What can you tell us about that?
Oh yeah, so I do a little bit of writing when I'm not putting my children to bed, which feels like all the time. But most of my day is spent where I'm working on we're building music software to make it really easy for musicians to collaborate and make music together remotely. So.
And do you fear that you might go down the road of the Moodify or the social car or anything else? Like, do you see it squidding out of control?
It's hard to kind of imagine how music software all of a sudden goes out of control. Like, I don't know, the drummer hits on the bass player and then we have a dating app. I don't know. Like, I mean, anytime you're doing content, you can get into problems for sure. But I think it would be a pretty exciting outcome if we built software that was really useful to a niche community, and just had something that worked really well for people. I'm not trying to build. This is totally not my VC pitch, by the way. But yeah, we're just trying to build something that works well and works nicely for people. And there are interesting things that you can do once you're able to connect people remotely, for sure. But I think the core of the product is all about music. So
you have 3 young children and you have a startup. And how do you find time to write?
I mean, most of the time I do a very poor job of that. And in fact, it's probably telling that most of the writing I've been doing has been like 700-word, opinion pieces for the New York Times, because that's about how the level that my brain can work on at like 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night. But yeah, that and you just drop kind of from your life the stuff that you don't care so much about, gym, that kind of thing.
Well, I want to thank you then, especially for giving us this hour and spending this time with us, because I know you are busy. And I recommend everyone go to Medium or go to your local bookstore and tell them to order The Big Disruption if it's not already there, or buy it on Amazon or buy it anywhere. Jessica Powell, you can find her at The Moko on Twitter, right? The Moko, TheMoko. And you can find the book on Medium. You can find her essay, and you can find her in various other places where she manages to write 700-word essays after she puts her kids to bed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on Triangulation. Triangulation records every week around, we put a podcast out for you, video and audio, on Fridays in the afternoon sometime. You can subscribe to the show, and then you'll get it exactly when it's released. And I am Megan Morrone. You can find me on Twitter at Megan Morrone, and we will see you next week.